Welcome, everyone. We'll just give it a couple of minutes. We know we have quite a few registrants, so maybe just giving everybody a couple of minutes to join. Just a reminder here that this webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be posted on our website for future viewing. And the slides also will be available after, so in case you want to just listen and not bother taking notes. Okay, so I am going to get started because we do have a full set of slides, and hopefully we'll have other folks join in, those who registered. So welcome to our ESSDive March webinar on model data archiving. I'm Charu Vardarajan, and I'm the deputy lead for ESSDive and lead of the community engagement team. So our objectives, and I'm realizing that the title slide hasn't been updated. It's going to be it's the March webinar. So our objectives for today are to provide all of you about some information on what ESSDive's model data archiving strategy are. First of all, describing what model data are, and then talking about some guidelines we've developed as part of our community data reporting formats and guidelines process. And so we worked with a lot of ESS modelers to develop some guidelines for archiving model data. And we'll be covering that today, but also generally talking about our capabilities for hosting model data. And if you have any additional needs that we haven't covered, we're happy to receive feedback on this. But at the end of this webinar, we hope you'll, first of all, realize that ESSDive is capable of hosting model data and understand our new guidelines and apply it for any data sets that you want to archive. So for the next thing, and I realize we don't have too many participants yet, but we did have a poll, and maybe Dylan, if you want to stick that in the chat, thank you. Just a question about what does model data mean to you? We'll just take a minute or here because the term model data means a lot of things to different people. And Dylan, you might want to put that link again. I see maybe someone new has joined, so thank you. Feel free to enter whatever pops in your mind here for what model data means. Output from the modelers. Okay, great. That's a common one for sure. Inputs and outputs. Yes, everything is right out here. Let's see. So we'll move on because I think we don't yet, we still have folks joining. So parameter calibration files. Thank you. Thank you. So all of these are correct. And so as per our definition here, model data are a variety of things. They include the model outputs, which are, and model outputs in itself can be a lot of different things. It could be raw files. It could be some higher level output files because there may be multiple of these outputs that you have for different simulations, and then you might only present one or two in a figure or table in your paper. So there's a variety of different model outputs that can be archived. There's input files like the parameters, the forcings, the calibrations, like we saw earlier. There's metadata files about the model and how you run the model or how do you interpret the output. There's code and scripts, which are, the code's different. The code's the actual model code itself. And then we have scripts that allow you to do some pre-processing or setting up or running the model, as well as visualizing the data, and then the visualizations itself. So all of this can be considered to be part of model data and components that are worth archiving. So ESSDive actually has, and this is a frequent question we get asked is, when is ESSDive ready to take model data? And the answer is that we already are archiving model data. There's a few data sets that are out there. This screenshot shows some that was archived by Anthony Walker on the FaceMDS project. And you can see here that there's multiple of these different data sets, inputs, outputs, as well as testing data. But then there's also just this recent publication that was about, some really high resolution, 34 years of data that was produced by a model, and that was output only, but it's a much larger data set that's also of different provides different values. So basically, we can store a variety of different model data types, and we're kind of agnostic to the specific formats or the domain, the model domain here. I think our biggest bound is more in terms of the size and the volume of the data, which I'll get to later. So let me just talk to you a little bit about first of all, we've developed these guidelines for model data archiving, but we had a community-oriented process to do this. And I'll walk you through that process. It's very similar to the process we've used for developing a lot of our community data reporting formats. But first of all, because model data is stored in other places, we did do an extensive review of data systems that store model data. And I will sort of have a screenshot of the paper that summarizes this review, but we've got all this documented in a paper that just recently got published in Data Science Journal. So we looked at, across the Oak Ridge DACs or the other NASA systems. We've looked at ESGF, we've looked at the Arctic Data Center. And they're all kind of different. Some of them have a little bit more specific guidelines for model data. Most of them are pretty generic for any data types, but they also have limitations on how much data are technically allowed to be stored. Or in most cases, some of that is not really very clearly specified. So, and some of our limits within ESSDive are at the time of publication. And of course, we are continually updating our system and enabling greater capacity for storage. But this is pretty current for now, is 500. Anything that's over 500 gigabytes is considered only upon review. That's our sort of a limit for when we ask you to reach out to us. So other community guidelines that we looked at, so we looked at AGU, and AGU has some guidelines on fair data for models, but that was didn't have that much information. The most extensive model data specific information was by this project funded by the NSF EarthCube Initiative, and they had this very extensive rubric asking various types of questions on, what your workflow was, whether it's, in terms of your pre-processing, processing, all of this stuff. You then get a score, and it's like multiple different sections for different pieces of your simulation. And then you get a score for each of these questions, and then you add it up, and that would tell you whether or not your data were worth archiving. So we kind of felt that this was like a lot of information for, and it didn't specifically call out which components of model data needed to be archived. And so we went through our own review process within the ESS program for what makes sense for us within our community to be, to archive as model data. So we did this background research here, and then we pinged a lot of people through a form that I'm going to just show you next. And then we came up with a draft white paper for what we thought the community wanted. We got a lot of feedback on that white paper through webinars, and then published a final white paper. And then following the publication of that white paper, we actually conducted more in-depth case studies where we picked a few papers that modelers within our community had published model data, either on ESSDive or somewhere else, and looked a little bit more about, what was their process, what did they put in their data and code availability statements, and what are some good highlight examples for how do you actually indicate in your data statement about where the model data are located. So based on this, and we did quite a few user interviews based on these case studies, and then published our final guidelines, which is now documented in this paper that I just talked about. So these were the questions that we really asked some of the modelers, and the questions were, first of all, understanding what models are being used across these different projects, what are the file storage, and how much volume of data are being stored, And then sort of really asking all these people what is worth archiving and how long does this data be useful for storing in the long term, especially if you want to have large volume model outputs and you make that publicly available. We want to make sure that that's useful in the long term. And then we asked them about what their archiving protocols were and what they wanted from ESS-DIVE with respect to archiving model data. And this, like I said, this questionnaire was circulated widely through the ESS cyber infrastructure working groups, and we conducted all these webinars to get the feedback. We got quite a bit of feedback from 12 different modelers, and representing a spectrum of different projects across our DOE community, and that included a lot of the ESS models were covered in this, but also included a couple of other, outside of ESS, including the E3SM and Rubisco projects here. So sort of this is summarizing here the set of models that are used across ESS. It's very diverse in terms of the types of models, in terms of the, even if it's like one-dimensional versus three-dimensional modeling, but also in terms of just, the physics and what these capture and how these work. And so that's part of the challenge here, is the diversity of models we found in this terrestrial modeling space. There's a very large variety of them. And so capturing guidelines, what we wanted to do was capture some guidelines that were fairly applicable to all of these different model types and wasn't very specific to a particular type of model. And so that's what you're going to see here. Is this isn't going to specify some variable names that are very specific to a particular type of model. This is more about how do you generally archive data that comes out of this very broad spectrum of models. And so here's again this table from the paper that summarizes all of these different models, but we also want to understand what is a typical simulation that people might want to store. And this again had a very huge spectrum depending on the spatial resolution of the model run itself, as well as the temporal duration, like the entire time scale. If you're running this for 1 year versus 300 years, obviously all of that adds up in terms of model output, as well as the spatial extent. If you're modeling something over a few meters to hundreds of kilometers or global scale, obviously that also affects your model output and the model sizes. So very typically, the number of files per simulation was somewhere between 5 to 5 few million, as you can see, very large range. But we had some sort of general, we had a sense that this was about somewhere in the hundreds of gigabytes to terabyte size range. This wasn't like petabyte scale data that were being generated out of these models. And roughly, we saw that there was a mean of about 28 terabytes per model, but that's a bit on the higher side. It's more like within a terabyte-ish range is what we estimated would be the initial model needs, model data archiving needs in terms of volume and storage. Now, if your model is different and doesn't fall within this range, we're happy to hear about this use case, but this is kind of the broad sense of data volumes and data storage sizes that we got from this feedback that we did actually a couple years ago or so. The other questions that we started asking is, what is it that's worth archiving? Do we want to store model outputs? Because maybe, your models change over time, and is it worth keeping this model outputs for the long run, especially if the models are going to change over time? And so, and part of this is motivated because journals as well as funders are requiring data to be archived now over time. So, the question is what do we really want to store here? And from our feedback, and this is all of this, the next few slides are going to show you the results from a rank order of 1 to 5, where 5 is the most important and then 1 is not important. And pretty much everyone felt universally, we want to store every aspect of model data, all these different components. That includes inputs, includes outputs. Outputs is perhaps the bit most ambiguous of this, and I'll get to that a bit more. But metadata, code, scripts, validation data, all of this was considered to be important. And the only reason why people were hesitant about model output was partly because of the size. And so the question was not, is model output worth archiving? I think there was universal agreement, but it was more about what parts of model outputs are worth archiving, and do we only store the stuff that correspond to figures or tables or key conclusions in your paper, if that's associated with a paper, or do we want to store everything else, like all the raw output, all of that? There was also a little bit of ambiguity around model code, because some of the code doesn't really is evolving continuously, and I'll talk about that as well. And then the next question was, is model data useful in the long run, especially because the codes are going to evolve over time, and so it may not be worth storing this for tens of years if the model itself is outdated, and there's a newer version of the model and some newer simulations that come along. And I think there were enough people who felt that there was sufficient value in archiving this for the long run. But pretty much a lot of the people were like, within 5 to 10 years, for sure, that's very useful. Over 10 years, there's a little bit of a drop there, but I think there was still value, and that's what people felt. And then the last question, sort of summarizing this, was, what purpose does storing model data and publishing your data serve? And of course, the usual thing about transparency and reproducibility of your research ranked high, but there was a little bit of question about the reproducibility, and I think I'll explain it in a sec, but there was ambiguity in terms of what does reproducibility itself mean. But a lot of other things that people felt was important was also in terms of being able to reuse model outputs for intercomparison projects, so MIPS model, and then other sorts of synthesis efforts, especially when people wanted to compare model output with observations. There was some feeling, especially, and I hear this from people who collect data in the field a lot, is that they want to compare their data against model output, but they don't have the expertise to run the models themselves. So having data that's generated from a model in a publicly archived way that they can compare observations to is very useful, even from an empiricist perspective. So the reason why reproducibility didn't rank as high as the others is a question regarding bitwise reproducibility, which I think everybody agrees is universally hard, if not impossible, to do with model data. So this is not about bitwise reproducibility, but more about reproducibility of the workflow that generates the model data. So I think the question was not particularly clear, and so different people ranked that a little bit differently based on what they thought was reproducible or not. But I think people did agree that the workflow for generating the model data needs to be reproducible. And then the other piece of it, which we had asked questions about, was specific standards. And everybody said that they wanted the model, whatever data that's being published, to be machine readable and have critical metadata that you can use to interpret the model outputs and include all of this information on the workflow. We didn't actually go into specific models and harmonizing, say, data column names or specific variables. But most people said they were willing to learn new guidelines or a reporting format if there were one, specifically for, if you pick an example, a particular MIP project, a model intercomparison project, and people had defined new guidelines for that, as is done in CMIP, for example, people were willing to learn these new guidelines. So that might be something to think about for the future, but we didn't go that far in this particular set of guidelines. So I just want to stop here. I know there's a lot of things covering what people felt was important. I'm going to go into the actual guidelines itself next as part of the next section, but just wanted to stop here and see if anybody had any questions before I move to the next section. I'm not hearing or seeing any hands raised. Feel free to put them in the chat. I haven't been monitoring the chat here, but I don't see any questions. Okay, so let's start talking about the guidelines. And here's a snapshot of this paper that I said was published, and it just came out in February. So all of this material that I covered in that last section, as well as in the following sections, covered in this paper. And Dylan, if you could post the link to the paper in the chat, that would be really great. Okay, so First of all, this is what we had said would be important components of model data to be archived. And so the first thing is metadata, which usually we just specify as part of any data package you archive on ESSDive. But you could also have any optional files that add metadata, but the basic metadata should be captured as part of a data package. And then we had required files, which are model inputs, outputs, code, and scripts. And there's ways to get around if you don't need to archive some of these because they exist somewhere else. But these are what we say are required. And then as optional, we have something called file level metadata that enables you to report what types of files you're archiving, but also testing and validation data. And mostly that's optional because typically the testing data are available are not something that the modelers themselves generate. It's available through someone else. And so that's partly why it's optional. And then finally, any sort of user guides or documentation that you want to provide with respect to either the model or interpreting the data. So the input files, these are required again, unless they're publicly available somewhere else. And these include things like the forcings, any parameterization, your mesh that you did for the model domain. And as with all files that we typically store on ESSDive, we do want open source formats. So things like CSV, NetCDF, HDF5, all of these are acceptable. And we have some guidelines on specific file names. I'm not going to read through all this. It's just here in case you want to go back to these webinar slides and look at a summary of these guidelines. It's just here for you. And just some of this feedback is directly from modeler expertise on trying to use file names that, for instance, the case sensitive file system was just because, people have run into this as an issue before. And anything that whenever you have files that the model relies on, it's always a good practice to document that in your metadata or your user guide. So the one feature which I will be highlighting later on is this new feature that ESSDive released, and we had a webinar on this last month in February on external linking. And so this is more a feature where if you have your data files published in an established repository somewhere else, like input files, which might be possible if, say, your climate forcing data is from DAMET, just as an example, and that's located on the Oak Ridge DAC. There's no reason to replicate that on ESSDive. And so we could add an external link to that existing data set on another repository that's an established repository. And we can talk through that later on if you have a question. And then the model output files, again, as some of you pointed out, are the first things that people think about as model data. So those are important. But the critical aspect is to figure out what the storage limitations of the repository are. So within ESSDive, it's 500 gigabytes per file. And in general, if you have a data package that's greater than a ½ gigabyte, we ask you to contact us as per our terms of use regardless. And we're still trying to figure out exactly what's the max size on a data package. But for now, per file limit is what we're specifying is our repository limitation. We have a decision tree that I'll get to later on that talks about what you can do if your model output files exceed this particular storage limit. But you can make some decisions on, do I want to archive everything here or just archive the key findings? And Val, you got a point to make?
Yeah, I think it's just a typo there. It's a ½ terabyte or 500 gigabytes.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Yes, that is a typo. We'll correct that before we put it on our website. Thanks for pointing that out.
And Char, one more thing to add, I guess this is mostly a preview to an upcoming slide, but we are working on a way to get files bigger than that through a special secondary storage mechanism, which is another reason why you should contact us and we can see if that might work in your time frame.
Yeah, thanks for that heads up, Trias. We will get to that later today. So did either of you have anything else to add, or can I move on to the next?
I'm good.
Okay, thanks. So the next thing is about model software that's related to this. And this could be either model code or other sorts of scripts that you use for pre-processing the data or for visualizing the data. So the model code, very often some of these models especially are big, DOE models like FATES or Parflow or ETS, all of these different models, they're developed by a big, large software team, and we have them located on a GitHub somewhere. They're being actively worked on and developed. So our goal is not to pretty much store the GitHub within ESSDive, but more specifically, I think what the recommendations for here is, one, make sure that you add a link to any model codes in your user guide so that people know where the actual code is. But you want to make sure that the very specific version and that commit that was used to actually generate the outputs in your model, in your paper, or the models that outputs that you're trying to archive and publish, that specific version of the software is tagged, one, but also available somewhere in an established repository so that you can actually link to that. So one thing that we've run into, which we've gotten a couple of questions on, is with respect to licensing. Because often your model codes as well as your software might be available through a different license that might be a BSD or MIT or whatever license that makes sense from the model's perspective. But data sets on ESSDive are published using the CC0 or CC by 4 license. So there is a question as to what license should this code be available. And so one of the things we've suggested here and open to feedback is, you register your code with DOE code, which gets you a DOI, and then you can include the specific commit or hashtag, and then we can add that as an external link within ESSDive. Now, if that doesn't work for you, we'd like to hear about this use case. But the idea is to not replicate the entire repository on ESSDive, especially if it's evolving, but trying to add a link to the code, but that's in a way that can be recovered and retrieved in the future. Another feature that some modelers have used is to use the feature in GitHub that allows you to get a DOI through Zenodo for a specific version. And then that becomes archived in Zenodo, which is a repository, and you can include that link to that specific commit in your data availability section as well as part of your data set. So there's a few options here. And hopefully this doesn't become too burdensome, but we do want, some, as part of the reproducibility, to know where the model is and what version was used. And then with scripts can be many different things. And obviously there's a spectrum of what scripts are. Very typically, most of these, the run scripts that you need to run the models, those should be archived. But there are other scripts that may be pre-processing or other sorts of scripts. And sometimes those are Jupyter notebooks, sometimes those are other types of scripts. And you can archive those as well in your data package. So the elements that we think are optional but highly recommended are file level metadata. I'll get to that in a second, as well as validation data. And as I said, it's mostly because very, very typically validation data are available from someone else. It's not data that the team itself is generating. So you want to add that as a reference for your model data package. And then any user guide that talks about the model itself, the specific version, and important enough, a citation for this model code and licensing and this model data so that people can give you credit for the model data that's being archived and the code that's being archived. So here's a quick note, and there's not too much information here. We've actually given webinars on what file level metadata is before. So this is basically information about the specific types of files that includes things like, what the file itself is about, a brief description, and what start and end dates of data that's covered within the file. And this generally helps people understand why this particular file is useful, what purpose it serves. And it can be sort of, instead of having everything in a very elaborate text README, this provides a bit more easier information that can be parsed so that we can actually do something in terms of helping people search and locate these files easily. And so here's an example. And we have a whole, a community repository that has all of these different reporting formats. And Dylan, if you can post the link to this FLMD format in the chat, that that you can use this template and you can apply it for many different files. So if you have model files that are 1,000 files and you don't want to do this, obviously, a description per file, you could just use a wildcard and say this description applies to all of those 1,000 files because they're all output generated from the same model. So hopefully this is not too much work, but again, we'd like to hear some specific examples of this particular FLMD template is a bottleneck for your model related data sets. That's something we'd like to hear feedback on. So here's the last thing I think that's part of these guidelines, and this is more about if your model data is, what are some criteria that you would use to package up your data? And like I mentioned earlier, that the file size and repository storage is going to be a key criteria. But the first thing is authorship. So very typically input data and output data may not be the same lead author or even set of authors. And so that might be a good criteria for why you want to break that out into separate different packages. So your input data were generated, say there's some sensors that you have in the field, and that was a different team, and then the model team is different, right? So you might want different data sets to publish those two inputs and output data packages just because the authors are different. The other big criteria is about the storage, and you might want to break up your file into multiple subfiles just so that you can sort of meet the storage capacity limitations of the repository. And so again, whether you want to publish this under one DOI or multiple DOIs, I think that's another decision you need to make. If it's just for the size limitation, you can still keep it under one DOI, but it's just the individual file size that we've got a limitation on, which is 500 gigabytes. And as Shreyas alluded to, we are sort of exploring ways to increase the size there. So talk to us if you run into that issue. And then I think the final thing is to really think about here. And so this gives you the green things, tells you when, at which point you want to publish your data, and you can walk through this decision tree to see what some of these decisions you want to make. And then the final thing is, what do you think is worth archiving in the long run? It's a little bit of a scientific decision here. Like, oh, you might have run hundreds of different simulations, just tweaking the parameters here and there to just see, what does that do? Does that add some uncertainty, or just some experiments that you were running? And those may not be worth archiving. So that's your call. It's a completely scientific decision on what you think is worth archiving, and we're not going to give you guidelines on that. But it's just something you have to consider is what you think will other people find useful, and publish that. So the final thing here is to make sure that you cite your model data sets and any links to the data and code in your in two places. One, in the data and code availability section that's in the paper, but you could also include it in the methods or somewhere else. And then, but make sure that you add them as references in your bibliography, because that's how those citations for the model data will get picked up. And here's a screenshot of an example of a data set here. That's the citation, and you can copy your citation, but your citations here, that will also link to any papers that cited this particular data set. So here's, and I'm not going to read through the next 3 slides, give you some examples of how you can cite your model data in your data and code availability sections. And these are from actual papers that our team, our modeler team, have published over the last few years. And these are some good examples, I think, of different use cases you might have with respect to model data and how you want to cite them in your papers. So this specific example relates to where a paper which had different types of data. So different input data sets, validation data sets, as well as outputs. And so what Anthony here did was actually create different data sets on ESSDive. This was one of the earliest things that we published here. We recommend actually using the DOI for the data set, and because this will probably redirect to the DOI, but using the DOI for these different data sets and including those as citations in your references. So this is one example. Another example here is a paper that Charlie Coven published, and this one that also had this issue of having external model code, which is the FATES model, which is available through its repository. And here you could see that they created a specific they talk about the specific commit that this output was based on, and also they got a DOI through Zenodo for that specific commit that's also cited here. So this is an example where now that specific version of the code is documented in this external repository and is cited in the paper. So these are some examples here for how to do this well in terms of including your model code as part of your code availability section. And then here, there's another example from Ethan Kuhn's paper that talks about how you want to, again, got the same idea about making sure that there's a DOI for the specific tagged version of that code, but also has scripts. So things like Jupyter notebooks, as well as the input data files, and all of that was archived as different data packages. Either this is archived through the NG Arctic long-term data. It's an archive which we don't actually, we can't add an external link to the NG Arctic data archive, but once those data sets are mirrored on ESSDive, those will be considered long-term data sets that you can archive. So there's a few things that I think here that, the ESSDive team can really provide input on how you can archive your data and what we consider long-term versus not. So if you have any questions about archiving it, we feel free to reach out to us and we can give you some help on and some guidance on how to archive different parts of your data and how to cite that. So I'm going to stop here. This was covering a lot and just give you all an opportunity to ask questions. All right. I'm not seeing any questions yet. General thing, does this make sense to you all, as those of you who are modelers here? Does this make sense? Maybe we don't have modelers here. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next section about ESSDive and features that we offer, but let's see what's going on in the chat. Yes, thank you. All right, great. Okay, so here are some features that we offer and some of our plans to support model further enhancements to storing model data. So first thing I want to point out is our API, application programming interface, which we use to upload data. And that example that I gave of Will Rudisill's model data right in the top was an example of a data set that used our API to upload data to ESSDive. And the reason why you want to do this is because this allows you to upload much larger files. The web user interface is kind of limited to how it's about 10 gigabytes per file and may not even quite be that. So the API is what you want to use when you have larger files to upload, and we have extensive documentation on this on our website. And we can also help you, especially for example, with that specific data set, we did help provide some of the scripts to actually upload the data set. So we can help you with that if you're running into issues with uploading your larger data sets. The other feature that I mentioned a few times in the previous slide is external linking. This is a new feature that, as I said, we just had a webinar on this last month. And this here allows you to archive a part of the data set that's on an established repository elsewhere and link to that within your data on ESSDive. So if your model code is on DOE code, for example, then we can add a link to that here. If your testing data are, say, example, on an LTR repository, we can add a link to that here so that it's considered as part of this data set. So those are other things that we could do as part of this external linking feature. And then this is the other feature that Trias had brought up earlier, which is we are really looking to store larger data sets than that half terabyte limit that I mentioned earlier. And we are recognizing it's not just model data, but there's other things like remote sensing and genomics that have large data, right? And so we want to make sure that one, it's a seamless experience for you to put these data on ESSDive, but also from a user perspective, it's also a pleasant experience for them to download a very large data set. So we're looking into this new tier 2 store. So one, we're looking into Globus, which is it's a software that allows you to transfer large data data sets, and both in terms of the upload as well as download. So it's a bit more of a pleasant experience. And then we have this new thing that we're working on, which if you have questions, Shreyas can elaborate on that in terms of our tier 2 storage layer, where there's some extra data sets that we store outside of our core ESS-DIVE system for very, very large data sets. And a frequent request we've gotten is with respect to hierarchies and preserving the hierarchies, because that's how some of the model data files are typically organized. And so this tier 2 storage right now on our core platform, we don't have the ability to store hierarchical data unless you zip up the full file. But on the tier 2 storage, that does give you access to this hierarchy. And then the Globus, which is what would allow you to use this large data transfer tool. So what we are working on is enabling larger files that are greater than that 500 gigabytes or greater than 100 files, which is, that's kind of a little bit of a limit. And I'm not sure if Val and Shreyas want to jump in on that. So that it's more about this hierarchy that you want to maintain for anything that's over 100 gigabytes. That's what this tier 2 storage will support. And then finally, one thing I want to point out is that we do have right now an ability to track in a loose way the data versions, because we publish the date that you access the data set on, which as part of the citation. So if you have data set, model data especially, and you're running new simulations using your model code and you want to update that with newer simulations, then the date that people have accessed this will provide some sort of a means of versioning the specific version of the data that they used. So that's another thing that we have an ability to do this, but if we are interested in hearing your challenges with using different versions of data, that's something we'd like to hear feedback on as well. So just want to stop here and see if anybody had questions, especially with respect to our new tier 2 storage. And Shreyas or Val, if you want to add anything more, feel free to jump in.
I think that was great, Charu. Thanks.
Cool.
I don't have anything to add either.
All right, so, okay, so I'm just gonna have to stop for a second here and reactivate another poll. But I think at this point, we just want to hear from you all about, does this make sense for you, and specifically what your model data archiving needs are. If anybody wants to speak up, does this cover the spectrum of things? Were you expecting something different that we haven't covered in this webinar? Feel free to speak up right now.
I'm not the one doing any modeling on my team, so this is really helpful overview for me, and I will of course be directing the modelers on my team to the recording, but this was helpful just as a summary for me.
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, I know some people emailed me saying they had a conflict with this time. So yeah, feel free to share this with your team and any of the modelers, and also send them the link to the paper, because that covers a lot more detail about specific things under each of these different components that you don't have space to clutter in a slide. And also talks about a bit more about the benefits about doing this, in terms of model intercomparison and synthesis. Other thoughts? So I'm realizing that we might not have the need to do another poll here, but let me try to go back to our webinar, and it'll take a minute to load up here. We did also ping the ESS community as part of that questionnaire about what they thought were some of their long-term needs with respect to storing model data. So a lot of the guidelines that we provided were very short-term needs, right? Like in terms of how do we publish data related to our paper? But one thing, I mean, in general, this is just summarizing what people have told us, which I mentioned earlier, is one, these data are very heterogeneous. They're very diverse, depending on which model is generating these data, but that there's a pretty significant disconnect between models and observations. And so I think in general, there was some universal opinion on it being difficult to take data from observations and use that within models or compare observational data against models. And so while the short-term need, which is what we covered here today, are about guidelines to archive the model data, in the longer term, what people were saying is it would be really great if we had a pipeline, this model to archive pipeline, where you hit a button and it generates the specific files you want to archive. That's something like a model to archive pipeline. The other things that people mentioned in this, which we didn't go into for the guidelines now, were things like Docker images, and can we store Docker images that represent everything in terms of your model ecosystem as an image that they can then archive, and then someone else can just download it and spin up the model. So those were things that were people had brought up in our discussions. And then of course, this concept, which has been around for a while, for data to model pipeline. How do you take observations and then, how do you make that be more ingestible within models with less effort than it takes currently? And of course, that's a longer term, grander goal. It's just given the diversity of models, but that's something, of course, people brought up. And so this is just giving a little bit about some thoughts and ideas. It's not something we have currently planned, but some things that we thought about and discussed with the different groups is one, just these guidelines for creating these standardized model data packages, and we haven't gotten that far yet. Here it just says, what do you archive? But we haven't talked about, file hierarchies, or how do you organize this in a standardized way that enables you to cross-compare different model data packages. That's something we can think about in the future. And then we talked about this, increasing the size threshold. But the other things that people wanted was to be able to extract subsets of model simulations. Like, I don't want to download a 2 terabyte model file just because I want this 1 year of model data that's, for a specific region. I want to just be able to extract that specific subset and download that. So that was something that came up as a need, or being able to even, archive that. And then, you being able to share and collaborate internally within your project before you publish model data. So we have a new feature that we're working on that's called Project Spaces that enables you to do this broader, beyond model data, for all sorts of data. To be able to collaborate within your project. But even now, just so you know, that you are able to share your data sets with your collaborators. You have to do it by, you have to add them manually by individually as a person. And what we're working on is being able to share this with your team. And then, like I said, in the long term, what people wanted was, oh yeah, here's the data I used for my journal paper. I just want to create an image or create a bundle of files that we could just upload directly to your archive. So these are some thoughts. If this resonates with you, feel free to come and chat with us and see if this is something you also want. And similarly for the data to model pipeline, that's a much larger topic. So I'm not going to go into this, but just wanted to throw out there what people have been expressing to us as community needs for in this space. So I think that's all I have here for today. Just wanted to reiterate that we are storing model data on ESSDive right now, and we have these new guidelines. These are very specific to land models or terrestrial models. This doesn't cover many other types of models, like including machine learning, but I would say that there are many aspects of this that are kind of universal, like what you want to store, inputs, outputs, code. That kind of applies to many different types of models. And this is useful to do because it does enable reuse of simulation data for a variety of purposes, such as model intercomparisons and synthesis efforts or comparisons with observations. And so what our guidelines tell you is, what components are worth archiving and how to split your data sets into different data packages And we have some of these features that we can hopefully helps you make this a little bit more of a seamless process and just like it is to publish any data set. So all of this material, we have a documentation that covers our guidelines, and that's available on our ESSDive docs. This particular webinar will be recorded and available on our website, so feel free to circulate this to your team. And there's some additional resources here that you can have links to if you get to our slides that tell you about where to find all of this stuff. So thanks, and as always, feel free to join our community mailing list or contact us if you have any further questions or comments. So that I'm going to stop and take final questions, and we'll end the webinar a few minutes early if there isn't any questions. Thanks for joining, everyone. Okay, so I think everyone's dropped off, so we can stop recording. Thank you.